Sometimes the hardest part of a lawsuit isn't who wins on the facts, but whether the case was ever in the right court to begin with. That's the core of what the Supreme Court sorted out in Hain Celestial Group v. Palmquist. In certain kinds of cases, the parties have to be completely from different states. Here, the lawsuit was removed to federal court, even though Whole Foods, the defendant, broke the complete diversity rule at the time of removal. The district court later dismissed Whole Foods, but the Supreme Court said that dismissal was a mistake. Because Whole Foods should have stayed in the case, complete diversity was never actually established. That means the federal court never had the power to enter a final decision in the first place. The justices were unanimous in an opinion written by Justice Sonia Sotomayor, with Justice Clarence Thomas also writing separately. The bottom line, the judgment for Hain Celestial has to be wiped out. The case goes back for more proceedings consistent with that ruling, including being sent back to state court. Stay with us, because the fine print of where a case is heard can change everything about what happens next. Nine Robes uses non-partisan everyday language to focus on the facts of what the Supreme Court is saying. Here, you'll find clear, concise summaries of every Supreme Court opinion, stripped of legalese and clickbait headlines. Each post breaks down the facts, explains the court's reasoning, and highlights the crucial details that often go unnoticed. It's not just about what the court decided, it's about why those decisions matter, to give you a deeper understanding of the cases that define our nation's legal landscape. These summaries are generated by AI. Be careful and consult reputable sources when in doubt. The Supreme Court issued a unanimous decision addressing a complex question: when can a federal court overlook a jurisdictional problem even if it made a mistake in dismissing a defendant? The case involves a heartbreaking situation. The Palmquist family sued baby food manufacturer Hain Celestial and Whole Foods after their young son developed serious neurological conditions they believe were caused by heavy metals in the baby food. The family made a strategic choice when filing their lawsuit. They filed in Texas state court and named both an out-of-state defendant, Hain, and a Texas defendant, Whole Foods. This ensured that federal diversity jurisdiction would not exist. Under federal law, all defendants must be from different states than all plaintiffs for a case to be heard in federal court based on diversity of citizenship. Hain removed the case to federal court anyway. They argued that Whole Foods had been improperly joined. This is a legal doctrine that permits federal courts to dismiss defendants whose claims lack merit, even if their presence would normally prevent federal jurisdiction. The district court agreed with Hain, dismissed Whole Foods from the case, and the case proceeded to trial in federal court. Hain won at trial. However, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals reversed the improper joinder dismissal. The appeals court found that Whole Foods should have remained in the case. Therefore, the Fifth Circuit vacated the entire judgment because the federal court never had proper subject matter jurisdiction in the first place. The Supreme Court affirmed the Fifth Circuit's decision. The court held that the district court's mistaken dismissal could not fix the jurisdictional problem because the dismissal was interlocutory. In other words, it was reversible on appeal. Therefore, the jurisdictional defect persisted all the way through the final judgment. Sarah Harrington's argument centered on two main points. First, she drew a distinction between creating jurisdiction and preserving a judgment despite a jurisdictional irregularity. She urged that Caterpillar, the leading precedent in this area, permitted courts to preserve final judgments when complete diversity existed at the time of judgment, even if jurisdiction was questionable at removal. This was not about creating jurisdiction retroactively. Rather, it was about recognizing that the jurisdictional problem had been solved. Second, she emphasized efficiency. After a full trial with extensive discovery, it would be wasteful to return the case to state court. The doctrine of fraudulent joinder itself, which permits dismissal of defendants with weak claims, would be rendered meaningless if courts could not rely on those dismissals to create stable federal jurisdiction. Harrington also presented a practical incentive problem. If defendants cannot rely on improper joinder doctrine to secure federal jurisdiction, they lose a tool that Congress implicitly authorized through the removal statute. Russell Post's position was fundamentally about jurisdictional integrity. Federal courts possess only the power Congress grants them, and that power cannot be created through judicial error. The critical distinction in Post's view was that Whole Foods was not gone for good. The dismissal was interlocutory, meaning Whole Foods remained a party to the case until the Fifth Circuit affirmed the dismissal. Since the Fifth Circuit reversed, Whole Foods never actually left the litigation. At no point did complete diversity exist in a final, irreversible way. Post also invoked plaintiff's forum choice as a constitutional principle. The Palmquists had exercised their right to select their forum by properly joining Whole Foods as a defendant. Allowing a defendant to override that choice through a dismissal would strip plaintiffs of a fundamental procedural entitlement. Justice Sotomayor, writing for a unanimous court, grounded the decision in first principles about federal jurisdiction. The opinion begins with the foundational rule. Federal courts have limited jurisdiction, and appellate courts must satisfy themselves not only of their own jurisdiction, but also of the trial court's jurisdiction. The general rule is that courts assess jurisdiction based on the state of facts that existed at the time of filing. If jurisdiction was lacking, then the judgment must be vacated, unless a jurisdictional defect was cured before final judgment. Caterpillar Inc. v. Lewis from 1996 is the critical precedent. There, a defendant was properly and consensually dismissed via partial final judgment before trial commenced. The jurisdictional defect was thus cured. The Supreme Court held that finality, efficiency, and economy concerns then became overwhelming, justifying preservation of the verdict despite the district court's earlier erroneous denial of the motion to remand. But Caterpillar is fundamentally different here. Whole Foods' dismissal was first erroneous. The Fifth Circuit found the claim against Whole Foods was plausibly stated. Second, the dismissal was interlocutory, meaning it did not dispose of the whole case and merged into the final judgment for appellate review. Under the general rule governing interlocutory orders, they are not immediately appealable but instead remain subject to review from the final judgment. This interlocutory character proved decisive. Because the dismissal could be, and was, reversed on appeal, Whole Foods was only temporarily and erroneously removed from the case. It was not gone for good. When the Fifth Circuit reversed, it restored Whole Foods and thus the jurisdictional defect that had lingered. The court rejected Hain's efficiency argument. While Caterpillar acknowledged that finality and economy concerns become compelling after a trial, those concerns apply only after a jurisdictional defect is properly cured. They do not override the jurisdictional requirement itself. To hold otherwise would permit courts to create jurisdiction through their own mistakes, a principle the court traced back to 1809 and identified as fundamentally inconsistent with limited federal jurisdiction. As a fallback, Hain invoked Federal Rule of Civil Procedure 21, which permits courts to add or drop parties on just terms. The court distinguished Newman Green v. Alfonso Lorraine, where a plaintiff sought dismissal of a party, from this case, where a defendant seeks to dismiss an opponent. The master of the complaint principle, that plaintiffs control which defendants to sue and where, is critical. The Palmquists had purposefully and properly joined Whole Foods to avoid federal jurisdiction, and they diligently asserted that right by promptly moving to remand the case to state court. Rule 21 cannot override that choice. Justice Thomas joined the majority opinion entirely, but wrote separately to express deep skepticism about the improper joinder doctrine itself. His concern is that the doctrine permits federal courts to enlarge their jurisdiction by assessing the merits of claims against defendants, asking whether those claims are sufficiently weak to warrant dismissal. Thomas argues that this represents an exercise of power beyond what federal courts are authorized to do. Federal courts must determine they have jurisdiction as a threshold matter before proceeding to the merits. To dismiss a party based on a merits assessment inverts that principle. He distinguishes the modern improper joinder doctrine, which turns on claim strength, from the historical fraudulent joinder cases, which concerned actual fraud or bad faith, such as lying about a defendant's citizenship or conduct. Thomas notes that other circuits adopt similar approaches, but he contends they lack support in this court's precedents. He suggests that in a future case where the issue is fully briefed, the court should reconsider whether federal courts can constitutionally dismiss defendants based on merits assessments. However, he agrees the case must be vacated because the Fifth Circuit correctly found the Palmquists had plausibly stated a claim against Whole Foods. The nuance here lies in understanding what curing a jurisdictional defect actually means, and how that doctrine interacts with the concepts of finality and interlocutory orders. The court's holding establishes that a jurisdictional defect can be cured only when the curative action is, first, proper, not erroneous, and second, final, not subject to reversal on appeal. In Caterpillar, the defendant was dismissed with consent via a partial final judgment. That dismissal was both correct and final. It established complete diversity, and there was no risk on appeal that the defendant would be restored to the case. The defect was cured before trial, and thus efficiency concerns could justify preserving the post-trial verdict. Here, by contrast, the dismissal was reversible because it was interlocutory. The general rule is that interlocutory orders merge into the final judgment and are reviewable from it. This created jurisdictional uncertainty. Until the Fifth Circuit affirmed or reversed the improper joinder dismissal, no one could be certain whether complete diversity actually existed. Find us online at 9robes.ai. That's the number, 9robes.ai. Like and share this podcast with friends that like to be informed. 9 Robes provides AI summaries of U.S. Supreme Court cases. AI makes mistakes. People make mistakes too. We genuinely do our best to provide you with the most accurate summaries, but our best sometimes includes errors.